So we'll start with welcoming you and letting you have an opportunity to introduce yourself to our audience.
Hi, my name is Mallory Stanislawczyk. I'm a pediatric nurse practitioner, and I am a long hauler myself, so I'm not currently practicing due to my complications with long COVID. And I am the mother of a now 4-year-old long hauler, though she was 20 months old when we got long COVID, and 2 years old at the worst of her long COVID symptoms.
So when did your family contract COVID?
So we got COVID in December 2020. My daughter got COVID December 1st, 2020, and I got COVID December 5th, 2020.
How did you know that child developed long COVID?
So figuring out my daughter had long COVID was a long and kind of tedious piecing together process, partly because at the time I was dealing with severe long COVID symptoms. I was bedbound and my family was very much in survival mode, and her symptoms were much quieter and harder to detect. And also because her symptoms were kind of buried in the fact that they could have been based off the fact she was also having other viral illnesses at the time, and also to a small extent could have been age appropriate. So my daughter's main symptoms were issues with dysgeusia or altered smell and taste. And a toddler is not going to come up to you and tell you that something tastes rancid or they may tell you something tastes bad, but not in the way an adult or a teenager will. They're not going to tell you, oh, this smells like skunk, this tastes bad, I'm not eating it. So for her, after we had COVID, she had her first ear infection, and then due to daycare, she was getting frequent viral infections, and so she wasn't eating well. And we chalked that up to she was frequently sick, and when kids are sick, they don't eat as well. So we originally kind of passed that off as that what was going on. She also happens to come from 2 parents who were picky eaters when they were young, and picky eating does tend to run in families. So we and this is 2 years old is when the picky eating tends to really pick up. So we kind of thought that was what was going on. But her picky eating became extreme to the point where she would have only one safe food. And it wasn't a caloric safe food. It would either be like veggie sticks or a waffle. But what the difference was, and this is where being a pediatric nurse practitioner who worked in primary care helped, is I was seeing that she was asking for foods. She would ask me for milk. She would ask me for other foods she had once liked. And then I would give them to her, and she would bring them up to her lips and either take a bite or bring them close to her mouth and then put them down and very sadly look at me and go, no. And then she would tell me, I'm full. No, and I'd ask her if she would want some. She'd go, no, I'm full. And she'd walk away. And then she'd wake up in the middle of the night crying because she was starving. And at the same time, she was falling off her growth curve. She wasn't gaining any weight. She was losing weight. She was being diagnosed with failure to thrive, which by definition is a drop in 2 lines on the growth curve. She was not growing anymore. She was 2, but she was still in 15-month clothes. We hadn't gone up in diapers. So we were seeing all these signs, but I could tell she wanted to eat. And that was kind of the difference with your picky eaters. Generally, they're going to eat the same amount of enough of the food they want or enough of what they need that they're going to keep growing. And she wasn't doing that. And I happen to have some dysgeusia as well, much more mild than her. But certain things smelled like skunk, tasted like soap. And that was enough for me to put 2 and 2 together and go, this isn't just colds. This isn't just your typical picky eating. This is something more. This is something neurological. And this is something, this started around COVID and this is not your typical. And we were at the very beginning, we got sick when even long COVID in adults was just taking off so long. The idea of long COVID in kids was really not out there. So we had to really fight and stand up and say, this is what's going on. And when we took her to ENT and things like that, they had seen, 5 other cases at that point with COVID. So we were very much at the beginning of things.
Can you describe your child's medical journey to date?
We got pretty lucky. One of the other things that helped me kind of piece things together was when she would get her colds, she would actually get a few more safe foods. And that was the other thing that helped me piece together, because when she would get cold, she would get congested. And I was like, oh, she's losing more smell. So now we can eat a few more things. And we had gotten to the point where she was really failure to thrive. They had talked about doing an endoscopy because I have celiac disease. They wanted to do that for her to check out celiac disease. I fought that because she hadn't had enough gluten to have celiac disease. They wanted us to give her gluten to then do the endoscopy. We couldn't get gluten things down her to get to the point where we could give her an endoscopy. We were doing feeding therapy and nutrition, but force feeding a kid when things smell and taste poorly wasn't going well. We had talked about doing an appetite stimulant. I wasn't on board at that point because stimulating her appetite when she was already starving just seemed cruel. And I was like, I'm willing to do that once we can get to the point where she has enough food that she's going to eat. But this girl's living on, veggie sticks. There's not enough veggie sticks in the world that is going to make up for what she needs. And she finally so we were at the point they were talking about putting in a G tube. They did not want to do an NG tube because with all of this, she was getting more oral aversion. So they didn't want to do anything to cause more oral aversion. We were doing a lot of food play just to keep her engaged with food as much as we could. She got a cold, and by the grace of whatever higher power you believe in, with that specific cold, she was able to take a nutritional supplement drink that time. And that specific time we had that with previous colds, but then when the colds went away, so did that nutritional drink. And for some reason, this time with this cold, and I don't know if it was because we were giving her vitamins with zinc. I had read, and I had known that zinc can help restore with taste and smell. We were also doing a little bit of smell therapy at home. She held on to that supplement drink. And so right before we were getting ready to do the G tube, it was the next appointment. I think like 2 weeks later, they were going to give the official okay for the G tube. She started taking that supplement drink regularly. And so instead, because that supplement drink was enough calories, we were able to put her on Periactin, or cyproheptadine is the other name for it, which is an appetite stimulant. It's also a histamine blocker and H1 blocker. And she, for like 9 months, just survived on 3, I think. We got her up to 3 Cape Farms a day. And then between that and doing some smell therapy at home and the feeding therapy, and I had her on zinc and elderberry and a couple other things that I personally put her on. Slowly, she was able to have enough nutrients to allow her nerves to regenerate. Younger kids' bodies are very regenerative. Their nerves are meant to make those new connections and make those new connections quickly. That's the difference between young kids and older adults. And even, people in their 30s, their brains are just a lot more plastic. And so thankfully, over time, she started gaining the weight back. She started getting more foods. She's still a fairly picky eater, she's now no longer failure to thrive. Now she's just a picky eater. We're still in feeding therapy, but she's no longer on the periactin. We do have like other GI issues. She's constipation and things like that, because when you mess all the intake in, you mess all the output out. Or mess all the output up. So we've had to deal with a lot of that. But for the most part, she's done pretty well overall. We work very heavily on introducing new foods in a very non-threatening way.
You mentioned smell therapy. What does that look like for a little one?
So smell therapy for a little one is very hard, because generally in smell therapy with older patients, you want to use scents that are familiar, and you want to think about a memory associated with the scent to kind of bridge, to make those neural connections. You can't do that with a 2-year-old. You can't be like, here, smell the lemon. Remember when we had a lemon? It's really hard to do. So what we ended up doing, and what Ian Hopkins suggested, is to use scents that we had used a lot with her when she was younger. So we ended up doing a lot of we used to do a lotion at bedtime for her when she was little. And so we used that. And it was just a lot of doing that same bedtime routine and putting in, having her smell it, and just letting her smell it. And then we bought one of those Amazon smell therapy things, and we waved it under her nose and said a prayer. We did so many things. It's hard to know which one worked, because we did so many things at once. I can't say this is the thing that worked or this is what didn't work. But I don't think any of, all of them were pretty benign. The smell therapy kits were very cheap doing that, plus doing, familiar scents, and, none of it was harmful. So I was more than okay to do all of them with her. And I think that mixed with some of the other stuff. But I think most importantly was getting the nutrition back in her body, because when your body's in that hunger survival mode, it's not going to rebuild those connections that it needs to rebuild. So if you're not getting the nutrients you need, it doesn't have the building blocks to rebuild those neural connections. And so getting her out of that starvation stage was the biggest thing, I think, for her.
What do you think, now that you've gone through this journey and are still going through it, what do you think parents need to know about long COVID in kids?
I think they need to know that they need to be aware of it across the board. It was funny, because when this happened, at our office, Miss C had just come up. So we at our office, I was lucky, because I think had I not been a pediatric nurse practitioner and I had her pediatrician not been, my office that I worked at and, had relationships with, I think I would have walked in and they would have been a little bit I'm not so sure about this mom. But I walked in and these were people who had worked with me. They trusted me. They knew me. And so I had a little bit of that bond. And, when I first said this, even they were a little bit you have long COVID, you're seeing it everywhere. And I was no, this is why. And then after I said that, then a couple of my closer coworkers and friends at work were calling me, and they were I'm now seeing other infants and toddlers with failure to thrive after COVID. And my bosses were saying to them, oh, you're doing that just because you know Mallory. And they were no, you need to listen to what happened to Mallory's daughter. We're not just saying this because we know Mallory. This is a thing. And I remember feeling I was shouting at the rooftops, and everybody was thinking I was crazy. And then about a year later, a friend of mine from work sent me an email, and it was a paper written about this exact thing. And I was see, I wasn't wrong. I was early. And so I think for parents, A, listening to your gut, and B, just knowing that COVID touches every age. You know, there was this myth that went around in the beginning that kids were somehow immune or not touched by COVID. From the very beginning, I always said, it's not that they're not touched, it's just we don't know what we don't know yet. You know your child better than any pediatrician who's going to see them for 10 minutes. You know, if you can find one who's willing to work with you as a team member and listen to you, that's gold. Stick with them. They're hard to find, but work to find that, you know, and trust yourself a little. You know, if you think there's something there, you're probably right. You know, and you may not be 100%, you know, dead on right away, but keep working and figuring it out. And I've always said to parents as a provider, and I know, and I feel this way with my kid, you're with your kid the most. You know your kid. You're going to know if something's off. So if you feel something's off, even if you're not sure what it is, it's okay to speak up. And if they go in and they blow you off and you walk out and you still don't feel okay, then speak up. Go see somebody else. It's okay. COVID does touch every age group. COVID touches fetal to 100 and plus. So, you know, this whole idea that there's a group that COVID doesn't touch, it's not true.
If you could choose one thing, I know there's probably many, but if you could choose one thing that needs to be improved to support long COVID kids, what would you say?
Oh, one.
I know.
Just one. I think just, and this is not just long COVID kids, I think this is just across the board, is that awareness that COVID's still out there and that reinfections, that just because you got COVID once and you skated by and you're fine doesn't mean you're okay. It doesn't mean you're not, you know, the understanding that one infection puts you at risk for other things. Reinfections put you at risk of other things. That just because you got COVID once and are okay doesn't mean you're okay forever. Like this idea, everybody's walking around this idea that the pandemic's over. That's not true. That, you know, I got it once, I was fine, therefore I'm footloose, fancy free, I can get it as many times as I want and nothing's going to happen to me, especially with kids. This idea that, you know, we can send them back to school without masks. We don't need to worry about anything anymore. That's not true. There's so much we don't know about this yet. And our kids' bodies are developing, their immune systems are developing, their brains are developing, everything about them is still developing. And we haven't even begun to understand how a COVID infection will affect that. We're only 3 years in. We don't know what it's going to look like 10 years down the line. So to think that we're safe in the sense of like they got an infection and it didn't harm them, I think is a little premature. So we need to protect our kids. Our kids are our most precious commodity. And, you know, biggest, easiest thing we can do, better air purification in every school right off the bat. That's for COVID, that's for every viral illness, that's for every poor kid who has an allergy or an asthmatic issue, just better ventilation in schools.